And I'm delighted this morning to welcome Dr. Dean Radin, who has a new book out, which I've just finished reading, and is really, I have to say, it really was a pleasure to read this week. Dr. Radin is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and an associated distinguished professor of integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He also earned an MS in electrical engineering, believe it or not, and then a PhD in psychology at the University of Illinois. Before joining the research staff at IONS in 2001, he held appointments at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, the University of Edinburgh, and SNUi International. And he worked on the US government, the top secret psychic espionage program known as Stargate, which I believe they made a really good movie about a while ago, which I really enjoyed. Dr. Radin is known for taking a critical eye towards practices such as telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. And he has spent the last 40 years conducting controlled experiments that demonstrate that thoughts are things and that we can sense others' emotions and intentions from the distance, which a lot of us here this morning have worked quite extensively with mediumship as well. He's also an advocate that intuition is more powerful than we thought and that we can tap into the power of intention, which can be used to help us lead more interesting and fulfilling lives. Dean is the author and co-author of hundreds of technical and popular articles and papers, has contributed to dozens of books, and has written 4 of his own books: The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and Real Magic. And in Real Magic, The Ancient Wisdom, Modern Science, and a Guide to the Secret Power of the Universe, which I've just finished reading and is really superb, he talks about magic as a natural aspect of reality and that each of us can tap into that with a little practice. So I have to say myself, I found the book a great source of information, really, on the history of magic, on some very unprevailing thinking and theories in esoteric areas as well, which I wasn't expecting, which was very, very interesting. And I found it very inspiring because he really offers a sort of a scientific view of magic and explains why magic moving forward now will really play a key role in the frontiers of science. So Dr. Radin, welcome to our group here this morning. Really, really delighted to have you. And I'm just going to turn the floor over to you now. And for all the rest of you in the room, we will have questions at the end of Dr. Radin's thoughts. So if you have any questions, just hold on to them, and then when he's finished talking, I'll invite you into the room where you can just type them into the chat box. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Karen. All right, so I'll get right into it here. Let's start that. So everyone should see the opening slide, I hope.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. So as Karen mentioned, my background is a mishmash of academic appointments and industrial research. So I've been, I got my doctorate about 40 years ago, something like that. And I've worked in a number of places around the world. Some of these are in Silicon Valley, UC Princeton, University of Edinburgh, and so on. Most of my professional career has been focused on the nature of consciousness and especially non-local aspects of consciousness. And people may not know it very well, but there's virtually everybody in the world is interested in these things. So I've been invited to give talks to a number of US intelligence and military organizations, some of which are shown there, and to most of the Ivy League schools and Cambridge and industrial places. The AAAS in the United States is the biggest scientific organization, and the British Association has a similar version. I've lost track of how many TV networks and shows that I've done, many around the world. About a month ago, a big show on CBS News in the United States, and also for the governments in Australia and Malaysia. So from a mainstream perspective, you'd sometimes be surprised that academia, government around the world are very interested in things that we would call psychic, but that's because people have these experiences, including in these places, and that's why I'm invited to give talks. So given that I have a scientific and engineering background, why would a scientist write a book about magic? This is one of the first questions I often get when I do an interview. And why would the book be endorsed by 2 Nobel laureates and by a former director at the National Science Foundation in the United States, major award winners from the National Institutes of Health, the National Academy of Sciences, president of the American Statistical Association, and many others in the academic world? Why are they endorsing a book on magic? And the answer is very simple, because we're talking about extremely common human experiences. So we did a survey recently among psychic enthusiasts, the general population, and scientists and engineers, and simply asked them, out of 25 different kinds of experiences that could be called psychic, things like clairvoyance and precognition and so on, how many of you have had at least one of those experiences personally? So not surprisingly, psychic enthusiasts said 99% said, yeah, they had at least one, and on average, 13 of 25 experiences. The general population, this is in the United States, 94%, at an average of 7.7 out of 25. And we were surprised that scientists and engineers said 93%. So this really is a common domain of being human. We're a little surprised, not only that so many scientists and engineers endorsed at least one psychic experience, but actually more than the general population. So these are important because they're experiences that force us to reconsider scientific assumptions about the nature of reality. That's why it becomes interesting from a scientific perspective, and probably more than that, it's important to understand what is wrong about the prevailing scientific viewpoint. So Karen kindly mentioned that I have a new book out, and at least in Amazon in the US, it's doing quite well, and the same Amazon in the UK and Canada and Australia, it's doing equally well. So people seem to like it. I'm not talking about fictional magic. There are many forms of fictional magic, including that kind of magic. I'm not talking about fake magic either. To illustrate fake magic, I'll do a little magic trick here. So pick one of the 4 suits. I want you to concentrate on the suit, and now find a card here that has the suit that you picked. And now I want you to intently focus on that card, because it's going to telepathically tell me yesterday which card you are selecting now. And so now you'll see I have removed your card. So I do this for audiences, and of course I say by a show of hands, how many people had your card disappear? And of course 100% people say yes. Yeah, so that's a trick. But I'm interested in real magic. So real magic is referring to the esoteric legends, both Eastern and Western esoterica. And it consists of 3 practices. There's divination, which is the stereotype is a crystal ball, but tarot cards and many other methods are used. There's force of will, which is impressing your intention to manipulate reality itself. And theurgy, which is what your organization is interested in, communication with and interaction with spirits of various kinds. So these, if you go all the way back to shamanism, these are the 3 classes of practices that are real magic. So as I said, about a month ago, I was interviewed by a news show on one of our big TV networks. And the interviewer said, what is ESP? She means, of course, extrasensory perception. So I told her, and then she said, but Sean Carroll, who's a physicist at Caltech, says that ESP is impossible. And of course, this is a journalist, and journalists like to poke the people to see how they're going to respond. So I said, well, at least from an experimental evidence point of view, it's very clear that ESP does exist. So then why doesn't Sean Carroll know this? Well, this is a very good starting point. Why is it that people who are spokespersons for mainstream science either don't know the evidence or they don't accept the evidence? Why is that? And the answer has to do with your worldview. It's about scientific worldview. So Sean Carroll fits into materialist worldview, which says that everything is made out of matter, including the brain. The brain is equivalent to the mind. The brain doesn't transcend space-time, so extrasensory perception is impossible. That's a completely logical position if you start from that initial assumption, which is materialism. Some people might think that's an idea of a joke. But that's the way that we are taught in science about how reality works and what it looks like. So the question underneath it is, well, what is the nature of the evidence? And I'm just going to go through a couple of examples here to show how we study the non-local nature of reality and magical practices. So does intention actually influence the world, as force of will would suggest? And does belief modulate that ability? And the reason why I study that question is because in the magical lore, that's one of the key elements that modulates whether magic is working or not. It's your belief. So we did this in the context of the tea ceremony in China. So this is members of a Buddhist temple in Taiwan. My collaborators there in the middle. And we asked the 3 Buddhist monks in charge of the temple to take a pot of oolong tea, separate it into 2 equal batches, to bless one of the pots so that anybody who drank that tea would feel greater vigor, less fatigue, and in general their mood would be elevated. And then they had the control tea, which is the same tea, but it wasn't blessed. We put the tea into little bottles. We gave it to 100 people. And each of the people were told that over the course of a week to record their mood at the end of the day. They're using a standardized mood scale to do this. So the 3 middle days of the week, they were told at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. to drink a little bottle of tea that we gave them. This was under double-blind conditions, so they did not know if they were drinking blessed tea or not blessed tea. So it's a standard randomized clinical design. So the placebo control condition is this, that everyone believed that the tea that they were drinking was blessed or treated. Some of them actually did get the treated tea and some did not. So this is holding stable people's belief about what they were getting. So everyone thought they were getting the treated tea. And this shows then the difference. So people getting the treated or the blessed tea actually had improved mood as compared to people getting the untreated tea. And so after the 3 days of drinking tea and days 3, 4, and 5, it's a statistically significant difference. So that shows that even under placebo control, that the blessing did something because people reported better mood. And I'm skipping over how we matched people so that they were the same personality, same age and gender and all that. So the 2 groups were matched as closely as we could manage, and they still showed a significant difference. So the blessing worked. There's the other condition, which is nocebo. This is the condition where no one believed that the tea that they were drinking was blessed. Some did get the blessed tea and some did not. And in this case, you can see that there's no difference. So this is a way of illustrating then that their belief about what they were drinking strongly modulated whether or not the blessing worked. And you can see that contrast here most clearly. That's an extremely significant difference statistically. So this says everyone was drinking the treated or the blessed tea, but some believed that they were and some believed that they weren't. And that's where you see this big difference. So belief does modulate intentional effects, just like it says in the magical lore. Another experiment we did to follow it up was, since we had done several experiments looking at mood as a modulator, we wanted to see if there was an objective difference with a blessing. So we used this little plant called Arabidopsis thaliana, which is like a little, I think it's called mouse crest ear or something like that, mouse ear cress. It's a mustard plant. So again, we had the Buddhist monks treat some water and have identical water that was not treated. And then we took the seeds, the Arabidopsis seeds, and then prepared in a standardized way. Some of them got the water medium A, and some got water medium B. One was treated and one was not treated under double-blind conditions. And then they were grown in the usual way. And what we're interested in is this thing here called hypocotyl. The hypocotyl is from the top of the roots to the bottom of the first leaves. And it's a standardized way of measuring how healthy the plant is. So the shorter and fatter the hypocotyl, the better the plant is doing. So if you get a long, skinny hypocotyl, it's not behaving very well. So the reason why we chose this plant is because it has a protein in it that responds to blue light. In fact, all plants have the same protein. It's called cryptochrome. And it's the plant or it's the protein in flowers that causes the flower to track the sun. And it's the same protein that causes certain plants to open when the sun comes up. So they're responding to blue light. But that protein is also interesting because it appears to be sensitive down to the quantum level. It is behaving as a quantum system. So we thought, well, that might be a very interesting protein to look at because maybe it's more sensitive to human observation than otherwise, or to this blessed tea. So that's why we use that plant. This shows the results of 4 repeated experiments that we did, and it's the hypocotyl we're looking at. So in each case, the treated or the blessed water produced a smaller hypocotyl length, which is what we were interested in. It meant that the plants are healthier. So in this then is simply a composite of the whole thing, that the seeds or the plants grown with blessed water did very significantly better than the ones that got the control water. The probability is 10 to the minus 14th, so we have high confidence that this was a real effect. I trust him. He has a science background. So in my previous books and a little bit in my current book, I talk about the nature of the evidence. But I also just wanted to mention this, that in 2016, the president of the American Statistical Association gave her presidential address to an audience of 6,000 statisticians around the world. And among what she said in an hour-long talk was somewhat unexpected. She started talking about her work for the US government in analyzing the remote viewing data. And so she said this in her talk: the data in support of precognition and possibly other related phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if they pertain to something more mundane. So this is important because statistics is the discipline within science that specializes in analyzing data. And so when skeptics say, like Sean Carroll says, ESP is impossible, I say, go talk to Jessica, because she's the spokesperson of statistics, and not only in the United States, but around the world. And after having analyzed the data, ESP does exist. So generally, when we find very strong statements like this is impossible, it means that they actually don't know what they're talking about. They don't know the data. You also find, this is very interesting too, this came out just a couple of days ago in American Psychologist. American Psychologist is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. It is absolutely dead center mainstream in academic psychology. And they have a major article in American Psychologist on the experimental evidence for parapsychological phenomena. And the conclusion is, just as Jessica had said, that the evidence is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. So this is not exactly a breakthrough, but this kind of article to appear in this journal will make a lot of people have at least one eyebrow raised. So I did a miniature version of what I just said to the correspondent, and she said, okay, maybe there's some evidence, but how did it work? And this is then really the core. This is the reason why I wrote a book about magic, to address this issue. How does it work? If I have to explain the meaning of existence, then it isn't funny. Well, that's one approach. And basically, this is why, from a mainstream perspective, a materialistic perspective, magic cannot work. And it's because we assume that the bottom nature of reality is physics. And from physics emerges chemistry, and from that biology, and that psychology, and somehow magically consciousness appears near the top of this pyramid. From this perspective, philosophers and some scientists have said that we're basically zombies. We're machines made out of meat. There's actually, consciousness is the last part of a long series of purely mechanical and materialistic events, so it doesn't have any meaning. So we're zombies. And so from that perspective, magic is denied. You can't have magic, it doesn't work. And so it is also not reasonable to throw away existing science. It works too well. We wouldn't be able to do this webinar if materialism wasn't true. So we have a problem. And the problem is we also know that ESP exists, so we're missing something. So what are we missing? Well, we're dealing with blinders. So this is an advertisement from the 1930s where the woman had blinders because she just didn't like new ideas. And the new idea in this advertisement was a refrigerator. So she didn't like the idea of having a refrigerator because of this stereotype of what she didn't want to have. And blinders is actually what we're talking about when you adopt a worldview. So the worldview within science is, I don't know how to think about that. Another way of illustrating this is I could give a talk about various kinds of ducks found around the world. And then we'll talk about this duck for a while. So keep that duck in mind. Meanwhile, we'll go and do something else and we'll say, are the dark blue lines in this display, are they straight? Well, they certainly don't look straight, but like most visual illusions, I'll put in a bunch of parallel lines, and sure enough, they're really straight. So this is your brain tricking you to see something which is not the way it actually is. And to give another example, and visual illusions tell us that we don't actually perceive the world as it is. We perceive it the way we've been trained to see. We construct a perception of reality. So when you look at this, it looks like there's some green bars and pink bars and blue bars. And so I'll just take away the pink bars and you'll see that there is no green and blue, it's just all green. So this is a very well-known color illusion. And now I'll slowly bring back the color. Let's bring it back here. And then you'll see now we start having green and blue again. So this is a color visual illusion that has to do with the way that your retina works. Once again, illustrating that what we see is not necessarily what's out there. So now we're going to have a talk about rabbits. And after an hour talking about these rabbits, we'll talk about this rabbit. But of course, by now you've already recognized that that is the same as the duck. And so this ambiguous figure is a way of, again, illustrating that slight changes in simply the priming of what we're going to talk about can determine what you see. So our scientific worldview determines what we see. So what are we missing? And where should we look for clues about what we're missing? So one clue is you look at what Isaac Newton did. So Newton is considered one of the first physicists, but he, of course, is known for actually writing much more about alchemy than about science. So we look even further back into shamanism, and maybe those people were onto something interesting. So here I'm talking about the esoteric traditions, everything from Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, alchemy, Gnosticism, the mystery schools of Egypt, of Greece, and now the new mystery schools, the Jedi mystery school, which started in the UK. We have the Knights Templar, we have the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, Theosophy, Christian Science, Gurdjieff, up through Aleister Crowley and Peter Carroll, who were part of the magical revival. We have evidence that Scientology began because L. Ron Hubbard was a good friend of Aleister Crowley. There are plenty of books out there about neo-paganism, Wicca, which is a relatively new invention, witchcraft in the modern sense. All of these are basically overlaps. There's of the esoteric lore and neo-paganism, Wicca somewhere in the middle. There's thousands of grimoires or books of spells out there. Sorcery for beginners. These are all now a relatively, not new, but a rising re-interest in these ancient ideas. You see this in books around the world. So in the modern era, and I mean from that about the 1920s, many books are talking about what affirmations, essentially, and channeling. And these are some of the most popular books in history. Billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of copies of these books have been sold. You see it all the way up into medicine. So mind over medicine is a way that these ancient esoteric ideas have basically become part of popular culture. So what I did was I would look through this entire history, roughly 10,000 years, maybe a little bit longer, to look for a synthesis about what does that entire domain of knowledge tell us that could provide a clue as to how can we understand that materialism works, but ESP works too. And so the simple way of thinking of it is a perennial philosophy. And Aldous Huxley's book is a good way of summarizing it, and basically it comes down to these three words: consciousness is fundamental. So the subtitle in my book is The Secret Power of the Universe. The secret power is consciousness. And all we do then is take our original idea of materialism, and we are now talking about the philosophy of idealism, which is doing this. It's simply putting consciousness below physics. We create a new assumption about what is the underlying basis of reality. And with this model, consciousness is before space-time. It's before physics, before space-time, and it's before the physical world. And just as in physics, you have electrons that emerge into chemistry, and in chemistry, you have molecules that emerge into biology, and biology have proteins that emerge into psychology, and so on. Now we can say that consciousness or awareness emerges into physics. So aspects of physics are aware. And likewise, it emerges into chemistry. So aspects of chemistry are aware. And importantly, the consciousness we're talking about is part of the fabric of reality before physics, in which case all of us, by virtue of having consciousness, are aware before space and time. That's why we can perceive through space and time, because it's before physics. So from this perspective, magic is not only accepted, it's you can predict that it must exist. So again, from an idealist point of view, mind is the basis of everything, including matter. From a materialist perspective, it's exactly the opposite. Matter is the basis of everything, including mind. So from all this, space, time, and mind all emerge from consciousness. So divination works because the mind can know everything. It can perceive through space and time. Force of will works because mind or consciousness manipulates reality. Reality emerges, physical reality emerges from mind. And theurgy works because physical embodiment is just one form in which consciousness can take. So the physical body is a very adept form, a very tuned way that consciousness can exist, but it can exist in many other forms as well. So here's channeling on the cheap. My name is Eunice. I have lived many past lives, most of them in Trenton, New Jersey. So are we to take magic seriously? Well, magical thinking is everywhere, all the time. Every time somebody does a superstitious act like this, that is part of magic. Prayer is magic. People are very intently doing something in their mind with intention. That's force of will magic. We find it everywhere in the world. We find here is Hindus praying for Trump. We have the Pope praying for something. In the United States, we have the commemorative presidential prayer journal for people who want to pray for Donald Trump. And we have magicians who had a mass binding spell against Trump. So we have a lot of prayer wars going on. The Catholic ceremony of the Eucharist is very explicitly a magical practice. So religion believes in magic. All religions believe in magic, but they strictly ban it. So you're allowed to do magic only if you are ordained, and only certain kinds of magic. Otherwise, it's very strictly banned, called heretical or demonic. And this, of course, led to the horrors of the Inquisition and witch burning and all that. On the other hand, science denies that magic can exist. We've already seen that this occurs because of the worldview that science holds, because of the materialistic worldview. So you do get, because people are interested in magic, you get books like this, The Science of Harry Potter, which is saying, it's a book about technology that basically says that if somebody could fly in a broomstick, here's how we could do it using technology. So it's not really about magic, it's about technology. And then you have militant atheists like Richard Dawkins, who doesn't believe in anything. So his use of the term magic is really more about awe. It's about the scientific amazement about nature of reality. Even J.K. Rowling was basically forced to say that she did not believe in the occult because she was being attacked by religious people for polluting the minds of our youth. So from the academic perspective, magic is false. It doesn't work. From a religious perspective, magic is real, but it's dangerous, so stay away. And from people who work in the magical traditions, the neo-pagans, the Wiccans, and so on, they agree magic is real, but it's not something that science can test. So much for magic, all gone, except for a small problem. And the problem is that the claims of magic have been tested in science. I already mentioned why we already know that that is true. The divination, power of will, theurgy have been studied for at least 150 years, and we know that these practices are talking about real things. So my first book, this is over 20 years ago already, was talking about how science studies these phenomena, how we know that they're real. The second book was talking about why what we know does not violate what we know about physics. The third book was about an Eastern esoteric practice, primarily yoga, which leads to siddhis, special powers, psychic powers. And my latest book now is talking about the Western esoteric traditions. And as a result of going through this exercise, basically what I'm saying is that the direction that these are pointing is the future of science. And so I can show here why I believe that. If you look at books by leading scientists in a number of different disciplines, this one happens to be in physics, talking about information as the nature of reality. Here's another quantum physicist talking about the universe as quantum information, mathematician talking about mathematics as the nature of reality. This is a neuroscientist talking about consciousness as the fundamental of reality. These are all thought leaders in science today. So the leading edge of science is already talking about the physical world is not exactly physical the way we thought it was. It's made out of information. It's made out of consciousness or mathematics. This just came out a couple days ago. Oh, no, this is an earlier one. This came out in 2016. The world's smartest physicist thinks science can't crack consciousness. You see this more and more in Scientific American, is a very mainstream scientific magazine where people who are thinking about consciousness are beginning to agree that it cannot come out of a materialistic viewpoint. That is opening people's minds to the possibility of idealism. This one just came out a few days ago. Coming to grips with the implications of quantum mechanics, the question is no longer whether quantum theory is correct, but what it means. And the important role is that there seems to be a primary role for mind in nature. This is a repeated theme you see again and again. This is from Nature, top scientific journal. Again, basically saying the universe is entirely mental. This is idealism. Consciousness is fundamental. You see it again. Everything from spoons to stones are conscious is gaining academic credibility. This came out earlier this year. Here in Nature Physics, the key point is that our experiment confirms Bohr's view that it does not make sense to ascribe the wave or particle behavior to a massive particle before measurement takes place. And by measurement, they're talking about observation. The closer you look, the more the materialist position in physics appears to rest on shaky metaphysical ground. Physics is beginning to put the perceiving subject back into physics. Again, in Nature, challenging local realism with human choices. It's a very complicated experiment, but the bottom line was that human observation seems to be one of the reasons why we look around and see a world around us. Consciousness is somehow responsible for the emergence of the physical world. We're talking here about the mind-body problem. Get up? No. I have that same argument quite a bit. So philosophers have been dealing with this problem for a very long time. And what science is moving towards is something like Alice in Wonderland, who pulls back the curtain and sees the matrix, that the reality is ultimately numbers, symbols, information, all of which have to do with consciousness. So why is it important to have a worldview, she asks. And my response is that your worldview, if you haven't seen the movie Doctor Strange, you should see it, because it is a very nice illustration of somebody who absolutely was dead center materialist and required this kind of demonstration to convince him that there was something more than material. So this is the ancient one who's pushing him out into his astral body. That's what convinced him. And for some people, you require that level of convincing to get it. So from a scientific viewpoint, we are machines made of meat. From other viewpoints, maybe we're something else. We clearly are machines made of meat, but maybe there's something more than machines made of meat. And the reason why it's important to know which one is correct is because the machines made of meat give rise to science fiction like the Terminator series. We're just mechanical objects. The universe is pointless. There's no meaning in anything. And this, of course, leads to nihilism, which is a very depressing way to live. Maybe there really is something more going on, something more interesting. Certainly the evidence from psychic phenomena, from mysticism, suggests that there is something else going on. Arthur C. Clarke said it in a nice way, any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. He actually used the word technology. I'm using the word science, but it's the same thing. So we're doing a combination of magic, who is the fairest one of all, and science, and state your sources. This is, I think, the direction that will be most fruitful in the future. So I think I'm going to stop there, and we can open for questions. So Karen, will you moderate the questions?
I will, of course. Yeah, thank you very much, James. That was really interesting. And I was scribbling a bunch of notes there as you were talking. And if any of you have any questions you'd like to ask Dean, you could just, if you want, just chat them in, put them in the chat box there, and we'll work through them as we go. But while we're just waiting for people to type there, Dean, there was a couple of things then, what you touched on today and what I read in your book this week, which I just finished, is the idea of expanding concepts of ESP to mediumship. So this is most of the people I can see from the list here, and from the Colchester, the spiritualist churches here as well, that obviously we are coming from a background where we just live with mediumship and the spirit world on an ongoing basis. And we know that, you know, from Gary Schwartz's experiments and stuff, skull experiments, it's very, very, very difficult to get any work done at that level accepted, because of course none of it can be replicated and none of it can really be measured and none of it can be double blind. Do you think that there is any, do you foresee any opportunities, do you think, for science to actually take mediumship seriously or worth sort of scientific study. The Arthur Findlay College does have a week every year where they do look at science specifically. But I do remember in your book you said there was just really no way of measuring that at the moment to know if that's true. Do you have any thoughts on that moving forward?
Well, what we can do is test whether or not the information that mediums get is accurate. And that can be and has been done under double and even triple blind conditions.
Okay.
So we know that what mediums do
Yeah.
is accurate. What we don't know is, where does the information come from?
Right.
That's the part that's missing. And that's, of course, very important, because if your experience is that you're talking to spirits,
yeah,
well, that's your experience. But we don't know how to say, how to objectify that, because that becomes an internal experience.
right.
The closest that we've gotten so far, in fact, we were doing experiments now looking at what is happening in your brain while you're channeling versus not channeling, or doing mediumship versus not mediumship.
Yeah.
So one of our early studies has already shown that if you ask a medium to do a reading, and then to imagine that she's doing a reading, and then to think of a story, just make up a story, and then to just be in an ordinary state of mind, that the brain is not the same. So the act of doing a reading is different from imagining it. So it's not imagination.
Yeah.
And it's different from a story, and it's different in many ways. So it suggests that there is a specific brain and mind state that is associated with the act of reading, and that's one way that we begin to objectify that something unusual is happening.
Right.
But being able to demonstrate where the source of information comes from is not just a problem in mediumship, but with any kind of psychic experience. We don't know yet how you get information, or how anybody gets information.
I suppose the other key sort of starting point there is if you can prove that there is ESP, and that we can communicate telepathically with another person in their body, then the first step then is to prove, I suppose, that consciousness is not an emergent property of the brain, because if we understood that, then we would understand that telepathy just happens consciousness to consciousness, whether the consciousness is embodied or not, right?
Right. So, and there's plenty of evidence for telepathy, lots of experiments showing that. A ton of evidence for clairvoyance, which is, from, when you think about it, a way of understanding what is going on, is much more difficult than telepathy, because at least with telepathy, you can have a model that's something like a radio.
Yeah.
That you can't do that when you're dealing with clairvoyance, because now you could ask somebody to mentally look at something on the other side of the planet, and they can do that. Yes. And even worse, they can do that 9 months in advance. So they're looking through space and time.
Yes.
So this, again, is one of the reasons why materialism is so difficult as a worldview to understand this. With the possible exception at the leading edge where quantum mechanics also is talking about non-local connections.
Yes.
So I think what's happening is that science is slowly catching up to these phenomena. And we're getting mathematics, and we're getting ways of understanding it to turn it into technologies. So eventually, we will begin to replicate in a scientific way, and usually that means we can build things, we can make a technology in some way, to reproduce telepathy and clairvoyance and some degree of psychokinesis and so on. Maybe this is a century away, or maybe it's next Tuesday. I don't know how far away we are from knowing this. But as we approach that, I think one of the reasons I'm saying then is that this line of research is pointing towards the future of science, is because science has always taken ideas that were considered magical and then naturalized it, and then understood it to the point where we're able to use it for something.
Right.
So,
like natural philosophy at one point was just natural events.
Yeah.
Half the time a volcano was caused by the gods, but
Right.
Yes, we catch up. And I find that's very interesting, because I'm just going to let me just go to Arthur before I ask my next question. Arthur is asking, do we have to envisage a new form of measurement or thinking to rationalize mediumship?
Well, yes, in the sense that we would like to be able to measure what it is that a medium is communicating with.
Mm.
And we don't know how to do that yet. So one thing, we did an experiment with 20 mediums, and there was this thing where we're measuring their brain waves and trying to find out what is the brain doing while or during a reading versus during imagination. So we found a difference. But we also asked, where is the entity that you're speaking to?
Mm.
Just point. And so almost every one of the 20 mediums said, up here. It's up here. The upper right backside of the head. Well, it turns out that in the brain, there's a nexus of several regions of the brain, which is the upper right backside of the brain, which is where you get a sense of the presence of another person.
Mm.
So if you had an injury to that portion of the brain, you no longer can have the feeling of another person.
Mm.
So there's something about that particular structure which is related, apparently, to mediumship, because that's where you get a sense of someone else.
Right.
So some people will then take it to mean that this is all brain related.
Mm.
Well, some of it must be brain related. This is why I'm saying that that materialism is correct. Neuroscience is correct. It's not completely correct. It's not that consciousness or awareness is being generated by the brain, because we can show that through ESP. That's not what's happening.
Mm.
But we don't want to lose the clues that are also available within materialism, especially brain science, which can it's the beginning of a way of understanding what is actually happening when you're communicating with a spirit. So part of it is related to your body and the way that we perceive things. We're working on ways of detecting extremely subtle changes in energy in the vicinity of someone doing a mediumship reading. So we'll be able to use those instruments before, during, and after a reading to see whether or not, does it make any sense to think of the locale changing in an energetic way? Or even from an informational perspective, we'll be able to tell if there's something about locally near the medium that changes, because people will report feelings, something
Yes.
is felt.
Yeah.
We want to see if we can detect that something is felt. So these are all baby steps.
Yeah.
Eventually trying to answer the question, where's the information coming from, and what is that thing that we call a spirit?
And it's so funny because as mediums, we just sort of know. We can feel the shift. We know that, even if there are changes in brain patterns at a certain part of the brain, for us, that's not because the brain is generating it, it's because the brain is receiving it.
Right.
So it would be very interesting if there came a time where we're able to actually put a scientific language around that, or to actually show that emerging. Let me just, Colchester Church has asked, is there any reason to move from consciousness as both fundamental and primary, as I think you described, to a kind of beneficence or love as religions insist? You understand what she means by that?
Yeah. I would hope so, except if you look at the esoteric traditions, both Eastern and Western, one of the very first things that comes out again and again is black magic.
Mm.
So black magic is not particularly a nice thing, and what it usually refers to is imposing your will upon somebody else's free will. So to cause somebody to do something that they may not want to do, or even it's considered black magic to pray for someone's health if they haven't given you permission to pray for their health, because that's now overriding their own internal self. So black magic comes up again and again because as social creatures, we rely on others for practically everything that we do. And so it's extremely seductive to want to get other people to help you or to do something on your behalf. That's all black magic. So as long as, if we hold the notion that consciousness is fundamental and primary, which is what is held in the magical traditions, there's no evidence from those traditions that that's going to move us into a kind of reality where beneficence or love are central. We aspire, I think, to go in that direction. And one of the things you begin to see as consciousness is fundamental is that there's a kind of Newtonian second law working, the golden rule, that the reason why black magic is told as a thing you don't want to do is because it will bite you in the end.
Yes.
It will, the world will react against that. So it's not such a good thing. Apparently, people aren't scared of that because of these long traditions of people using black magic for short-term gain.
Yes, and of course, there's always the thing of like, you know, if you're generating bad karma, it's there to dissuade you, which you talked about earlier as well. You know, when
Right.
you're talking about, you know, religions view magic as something you're not supposed to do, that they can do, but we can't. It sort of almost sounds like a method of inspiring fear to.
Oh, that very clearly, yes. So paganism was declared heretical and demonic purely for social control reasons.
Mm,
And this, you even see that to today in both religion and science, that there's the notion that we don't need a church to become enlightened, essentially, or to develop ourselves, is part of Gnosticism,
yes.
right? It's part of all of the esoteric traditions. So we have a spark of divinity in ourselves, essentially,
Mm,
and the church, as a social control structure, did not like that idea because then people wouldn't follow the church.
yeah.
So by simply declaring that some practices are evil and bad and made people afraid of it, well, that's exactly why magic has become an esoteric art
Mm,
rather than an exoteric
yeah.
art. And some of that fear you see very clearly within science as well.
Yeah.
So just to give one example, at Harvard Medical School, they were considering doing an experiment on prayer. And somebody suggested that since it's difficult to get people involved in a prayer experiment sometimes, why don't we pray for dogs that were going through spaying and neutering surgery, which happens all the time. So we'd select a bunch of dogs, and some would be prayed for and some would not, and we'd see whether or not the dogs would that were being prayed for would do better, would heal faster.
Mm,
And so one of the MDs on the ethics panel said, no, that we shouldn't do that experiment, even though everyone else thought it was a great experiment to do. Why? Because dogs don't have souls. So you find these ancient ideas,
yeah.
you know, where in the world would that come from? But this is part of the doctrine.
Yes.
Animals don't, only humans have souls. So prayer wouldn't work, and that's why the experiment actually did not take place.
And Pope Francis just came out recently and said dogs go to heaven. So much for that.
Yes. So
Uh,
now they have souls.
yes, but even from a mediumistic perspective, I know I have, and I know many people will be listening to the recording when we play this back. We've had plenty of experiences where animals and pets have come with their owners.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I know other people in this room have had this where I had a horse be the primary communicator one time.
Hmm.
You know, so we can see and coming with, and I'm actually able to, not speaking obviously, but able to actually share impressions with us that are, which is always I find very interesting. And
Mm-hmm.
it's people love their pets because the pets seem so helpless. It's so nice to know that they're okay.
Yeah.
Angela asked, will we need a new language to explain the phenomenon of mediumship in terms that scientists will accept? So is there anything that we can do as mediums to sort of speak in a language that would be more acceptable to the scientific community?
Yes. What that language is not going to be easy to develop.
Mm,
All language is based on everyday experience. So
yes.
among mediums, you can develop a kind of a secret language or a language of experience of mediumship, which you probably do. Yeah, right. You develop certain jargon like any discipline develops,
Mm,
but it won't necessarily be scientific until somebody can figure out a way of testing what the language means.
mm,
And this has been a problem all throughout history, where a mystic has an experience, they cannot convey the meaning of that experience because they're talking about a domain of reality that is not every day.
mm,
So you end up with two things. You'll have a mystic who has an amazing inspiration, and they'll immediately say it's ineffable.
Mm.
And then they'll spend the rest of their life writing dozens of books trying to explain it, which
Yes.
is impossible. So you see this in science as well, that at the leading edge of science, the nature of the mathematics that are used are so abstract that it's very difficult to describe what that mathematics means other than through the symbols that are used in the math itself.
Yeah. It's like the sort of a static experience that we've heard, you know, that saints, you know, Saint Teresa said, we've had these where artists have painted the face of the ecstatic experience, but trying to actually put words on that is an entirely different issue altogether. It's
Right.
very difficult to express that. Arthur has asked, how do you view the organization that is trying to use computers to communicate with the spirit world? I actually hadn't heard of that. So apparently there's an organization that's trying to use computers to communicate with the spirit world. So which begs the question, you know, is there a concept of God in all of this?
Well, I guess what Arthur is talking about is electronic voice phenomena and instrumental transcommunication, which are related to the idea of using technology to communicate with spirits. So I know some of that literature pretty well. My guess is what's happening is that the operators of the equipment is known to be an extremely important part of it.
Okay.
And that suggests that what's happening is a form of physical mediumship. That
Right.
the medium is the important thing, not the method, not the specific technical underlying method. And it's just, again, making the problem exactly the same, actually, as any form of mediumship. Because if the juice is coming from the living medium and somehow information is being gained, which could be correct, it still doesn't say what is the source of the information.
Mm.
So the idea of doing that is, for some people, it works pretty well. It doesn't get us much closer to figuring out this essential question of what is that disembodied entity thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. What's discarnate consciousness, or where is it?
Yeah, and where's and not only that, but where's the source? What is the source of information that the medium is using to get accurate information?
Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about ESP, the understanding is that the source of the information is from the mind of the other person. Right?
Well, for telepathy,
Yeah.
but for clairvoyance, you can get information about anything, anywhere in space or time.
Right.
That's the sticking point. If it was just telepathy, then you can figure out clever ways of doing things like proxy sitting, right? Because then the client doesn't have the information in them. And so proxy sittings were developed initially as a way of trying to experimentally test, is this due to telepathy?
Yeah. Which we all, I think, have experienced that it's not, because we've all...
Yeah, it's not. All you need is something that gives you an indication of what is the kind of information that you want. And from my research in remote viewing, that is exactly what happens for a very good remote viewer. If I can simply say to somebody that I'm going to give you a target, it's this blue piece of paper. This is the target. Well, what you don't know is that this blue piece of paper has a companion, or maybe on the other side of the paper, I've written the actual thing. Like, tell me what's in this house in this portion of the planet. So you never see that. I would know that, perhaps. Or even I can use a random number that even I don't know what it's pertaining to, and a good clairvoyant will still be able to give information. So how did that happen?
Yeah.
That suggests from a magical perspective that you have the universe in your head, essentially. You have access to all space and all time. And someone who's able to attend, to look through the universe, can find anything at all. And this, of course, then raises the question immediately that if you're getting information that seems to come from a dead person, or a disembodied entity that was never living, in a human way anyway, there's somewhere in the universe where there's the answer to what that is, so that we can verify it. If the information is not verifiable, then it's not an experiment. It might be correct, but we have no way of knowing if it's correct.
So
This
I
is the
think
sticking point, basically.
yeah, we've all sort of sat, I believe, with people and given them information that they've actually had to go off and that they didn't know. So clearly we weren't getting it from them. But what you're saying is that the question from the scientific perspective, or from the paranormal perspective, is where, because see, to us it's just a given that because we can feel the sense of the person around us giving us the information, we know where it's coming from. But you're saying from a sort of a measurement perspective, or from an analytical perspective, where could that information just sort of be out there in the collective information of the universe?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I showed the visual illusions and a magic trick, because our perception of talking to somebody, our perception of deciphering what it is that they're saying, and so on, a lot of this is brain stuff. Like our brains have developed over eons of evolution to be able to do this so quickly and without conscious ability at all. So the perception of speaking to a spirit could be very similar to a perception of looking out and seeing the room around you. And since we know that it's what we see is not necessarily what is actually there, it's a construction, we're constructing our experience. That's yet another reason why it's very difficult to figure out, well, what is actually there? The only way you can know what is actually there is to have something independent, an independent thing that is looking at it. All we have are humans at this point. We don't have any independent thing. So one of the ways of bootstrapping this is, since the focus of our research is intuition, essentially, of all types, that we're trying to use the mediums and the channelers and our own intuition to develop methods. Like if there are really independent spirits out there who may be smarter than us in these domains, help us figure out how to develop instruments or even techniques that we can use to figure out what you are in a way that everyone can agree that this is it, without having the need for a personal experience.
Right. But that's almost like asking to sort of measure God as well. I mean, we have these experiences that are by nature intangible because that's the nature of them. And sometimes I feel like it's great to be able to really start to sort of drill into these ideas and to start trying to get something more tangible around them. But I often wonder at the end of the day, is that just like saying, let's measure God? It's like saying, did God create the universe? Well, no, the universe was created by the Big Bang. Who called the Big Bang? Caused the Big Bang. You just can kind of go on and on about these things. And so I often wonder, is it ever possible to find, are we trying to use the wrong type of language, in other words, to describe these experiences?
Well, maybe. And so like a philosopher might say that we're committing a category mistake. We're trying to take the square root of an orange.
Right.
And so we may be asking the question even in the wrong way. On the other hand, you look at the history of science, there are many, many things that used to be thought to be way beyond our ability to understand.
Yeah.
And if we're clever enough, we do figure out ways of figuring these things out. Like we can detect probable Earth-like planets umpteen light years away now using clever methods. So I'm optimistic that we will eventually figure out how to do this. It's just that we're at a point in history where we're limited by language, we're limited by the instruments that we have. But that doesn't mean you stop. It just means you keep trying to become more and more clever.
I have to say, I really admire your work because I was just watching Christopher Hitchens the other night on the debate about God, and I thought it's just to be in that area trying to deal with scientists, and it just seems like banging your head off a brick wall. So I have to say, I really admire your tenacity in pushing through and trying to find answers and experiments to be able to sort of bridge this gap, in the language between the two world views, because I'm sure it cannot be easy. What I will say to the room, though, and I will say, because we'll be playing back this for people in other time zones who wanted to listen to you talk today but couldn't come because of time zones were prohibitive, that I highly recommend both Conscious Universe, which I really enjoyed, and Real Magic, which I just finished. It's a really delightful way. I really didn't envy the uphill battle you had, and even trying to define magic in a way that people could understand the concept of what you were talking about and what it meant for us in a sort of a modern society. So really, really enjoyable. So it's Real Magic. The full title is Real Magic, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Science, and the Guide to the Secret Power of the Universe. So how could you possibly pass that up? So I'll leave it there. I want to thank all of you for joining us here this morning, and especially, again, a very big thanks to you, Dean. And if you're okay with it, we'll put this on the SNUi website, and I'll be able to, send out a link to people who couldn't join us for whatever their times, because our membership is international. So and they'll be able to catch up on this afterwards if you're happy with that. Sure. And again, thank you very, very much for joining us, and thank all of you for joining us here, whatever time it was you got out of the bed today with us. And we'll hope that everybody reads your book. Congratulations again on it being an Amazon bestseller. So well done. Delighted to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you.